introduction. My name is Jeffrey Katz, and I'm the president of the Washington Map Society. So I'd like to welcome you to today's program, which is hosted by a partnership of 8 map societies from all parts of the country, including, as Ron explained, the Boston Map Society, which contributed to this program, as well as California, Chicago, New York, Rocky Mountain, Texas, and the Washington Map Society, and the Library of Congress's Philip Lee Phillips Society. All of these map societies are nonprofit organizations that support map collecting, cartography, and the study of cartographic history. We all supply financial support for this Zoom meeting, and if you're not a member, we hope you'll consider joining at least one map society. So please see the chat for links to each of the map societies' websites. Each map society has its own suite of benefits. For the Washington Map Society, members receive 3 annual issues of the Portaline Journal. I'm getting some sounds in there. Digital access to all past issues of the Portaline, digital access to past guest speaker lectures, and many other features in the members-only section of the website, including a members directory. If you're not a member, we have an introductory rate of $25 for the first year of digital membership. I'd also encourage anybody on this Zoom to sign up for our first annual dinner in a couple of years due to COVID, which will be taking place on May 20th. And Ron Grimm will give you some more details. Somebody could usefully mute, I think. We and our partner map societies would like to thank our advertisers who support our groups and also help make possible the publication of our journals, the Portaline and the Calafia, the Journal of the California Map Society. And I think the slide listed that. So a couple of details on logistics before we proceed further. Please note that the lecture is being recorded, so please turn off your video and microphone if you don't want to be recorded. Please use the chat feature to type questions, and they'll be addressed at the conclusion of the talk, which I hope you'll find very interesting. After the Q&A period, we'll leave the meeting open to attendees to socialize if they wish, as we usually do, at which point you can turn your microphone back on. And now I'll turn the program over to Ron Grimm, the WMS Vice President and Program Chair. Ron?
Ooh, thank you, Jeff, and welcome everybody to tonight's meeting. We have developed a monthly Zoom meeting for the rest of the spring and into the fall until November. The list of meetings will be listed in the next issue of the Portaline, and I will be circulating the list to the other map societies. Okay, now the next meeting of the Washington Map Society will be on Friday, May 20th from 6 to 9 p.m. This is going to be a departure because this is going to be the Washington Map Society dinner meeting, and it is our first in-person meeting in 2 years. We apologize to the other map societies that we will not be broadcasting it as a Zoom event. However, it will be recorded and posted on the Washington Map Society website. And if you are in the Washington, D.C. area that weekend, we invite you to attend, and registration details can be found on the Washington Map Society website. Now, besides dinner and socializing, the meeting will feature Matthew Mingus, the Associate Professor of History at the University of New Mexico in Gallup, and he is the book review editor for the Portaline. The title of his presentation is Mapping a Defeated Germany in the aftermath of World War II. Now, on the same day, the Philip Lee Phillips Society will be hosting a combined in-person and virtual event at the Library of Congress. It will be open to Phillips Society, Washington Map Society, and other Map Society members who may be in the Washington, D.C. area that weekend. The program is entitled The World of Ptolemy and the Birth of the Cartographic Atlas. It will feature a display of every early edition of the Ptolemaic atlases published between 1472 and 1600. John Hessler, who we've heard before, and who is the curator of the J. Kislak collection at the Library of Congress, will provide commentary on the display. Registration information is being sent out to Phillips Society and Washington Map Society members. For others, check John Doctor's list of programs, and I've included that URL in the chat function, but you will find a link for registration there. Now, the next Zoom meeting for the combined map societies is scheduled for Thursday, June 16, starting at 7 p.m. It will feature Lena Denis, who is now the Geospatial Data, GIS, and Maps Librarian at the Milton S. Eisenhower Library at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. She previously worked at the Harvard Map Collection and served as a past president of the Boston Map Society. The title of her presentation is The Foundation and the Gateway: What Maps Show and Hide About Baltimore and American History. She will provide a virtual tour of the Johns Hopkins University Sheridan Library's map collection, focusing on Baltimore as a city where maps reveal much more than a straightforward abstraction of geographic space. On behalf of the California Map Society, which helped organize tonight's presentation, it is my pleasure to introduce this evening's speakers, Julie Sweetkind-Singer and Greg March. Julie is the Associate University Librarian for the Science and Engineering Resources Group in the Stanford Libraries. She oversees the staff and support infrastructure to the faculty, researchers, and students for the cartographic programs centered within the libraries, including the Branner Earth Sciences map collections and the David Rumsey Map Center. Julie served for 6 years on the National Geospatial Advisory Committee from 2014 to 2019, and was chair for 2 years. Now, this is an advisory committee to the Federal Geographic Data Committee, and her attendance there brought her to Washington, D.C. quite often. She has taught at the California and the Australian Rare Book Schools on the history of Western mapping. Greg is the Map and Government Information Librarian and Associate Professor at the University of Tennessee Libraries. Greg manages the government documents and map collections, and also manages collections for the departments of anthropology, geography, and earth and planetary sciences as their subject librarian. He provides research consultation, instruction in the use of information resources, and collection development for those disciplines. He serves on the Tennessee Committee on Geographic Names. He was the chair from 2011 to 2020, and now a member. And he recently served as chair of the American Library Association Government Documents Roundtable. The title of their presentation is World War II Captured Maps, the Army Map Service, and 2 university libraries. So you will see how we get Stanford and Tennessee into the same subject area tonight. Their talk will describe a program developed by the Army Map Service following World War II that distributed captured German and Japanese maps to 35 libraries throughout the country. If you have questions, you may type them in the chat feature during the lecture. They will address a few of your questions at the conclusion of the presentation. We now turn the program over to Julie and Greg.
Thank you, Ron. I'll go ahead and share my screen in a minute. There we go. Let me go ahead and share mine. All right, everyone can see my screen, I assume. Okay, I'm seeing some yes nods, so I'll get started. Academic map collections in the United States have greatly benefited from their participation in depository library programs from different arms of the federal government, most notably the Army Map Service, the Library of Congress, and the Government Printing Office. During and after World War II, the Army Map Service served as a conduit for libraries to receive maps from overseas stockpiles of German and Japanese captured maps. Duplicate maps abounded in these collections and were distributed through the depository system to libraries willing to catalog, house, and manage the content. Housing the collection, while a challenge at first, turned out to be the least onerous of the requirements for receiving the maps. The greater challenge came in processing and integrating them into the collections with proper metadata. The integration of the maps captured from Germany proved to be easier than the Japanese maps as the language barrier was lower. The captured Japanese maps have been especially challenging, with only a few libraries fully cataloging their maps by the early 2000s, most notably Clark University and the University of California, Berkeley. Staff at Stanford University's Branner Earth Sciences Library and Map Collections cataloged and integrated their German captured maps into the collections throughout the 1980s and 1990s. The Japanese maps were cataloged and scanned in the last decade, making it the first library in the United States to have digitized the corpus of over 9,600 maps. This project caught the eye of Greg March, the map librarian at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, who contacted me to see if Stanford had any gaps within our collections that UT might be able to fill with their captured map collections. Ultimately, UT donated their entire unprocessed captured maps collection to Stanford, where they would be cataloged, processed, and scanned for online use. During this talk, we will provide background information on the capture of the German and Japanese maps and the history of the Army Map Service Depository Program. We will cover the history of the maps in both collections, the decision to consolidate the collections at Stanford, and the process of moving 1.5 tons of maps across the country. The next section details the integration of the maps into Stanford's collection and the degree of overlap between the two groups of maps. Finally, we provide some thoughts as to possible avenues of collaboration as more libraries work on processing their collections. Note that we have published an open access article about this project in a recent issue of the Journal of Map and Geography Libraries, and we will provide a link to that article in the chat.
Okay, I just provided that link, so that's in the chat now. The German military was sophisticated in its creation and production of maps and prolific in its output prior to the start of World War II. The Kriegswehrmessenwesen, a war survey division within the German military's general staff, produced maps at a variety of scales, 1 to 2,500 to 1 to 1 million, for numerous purposes during World War I. This output included terrestrial and aerial mapping, cartography, map printing, and military geology. Their output was truly impressive, with the surveying units printing more than 500 million maps, sending 275 million maps to the front lines. Mapping responsibilities changed during the interwar period. The Kriegswehrmessenwesen was immediately phased out in 1918. The Treaty of Versailles limited the size of the German Army and Navy and disbanded the Air Force. These and other restrictions forced surveying and mapping activities into the private sector. By 1929, military districts had taken responsibility for regional mapping. In 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Reich Chancellor. Over the next few years, surveying and mapping activities changed radically as the German government violated the Treaty of Versailles provision that prohibited the buildup of the military. In 1936, the General Staff of the Army was formed with responsibilities for mapping and survey, handled by the 9th Division, later known as the Kriegskarten und Vermessungswesen. In the same year, the Heersplankammer, the Army Map Service, was reestablished with the mandate to increase map production, with the Reichsamt für Landesaufnahme handling civil topographic mapping and establishing regional surveying departments within the Reich and beyond its borders. Maps created by the mapping units were also confiscated from stockpiles in occupied countries and reprinted as special editions. During the course of World War II, the Heersplankammer moved out of Berlin to Saalfeld, Thuringia, to escape air raids. The 7th General Staff Division of the Luftwaffe also produced maps, and they too were centered in Saalfeld by 1943. These moves centralized the repository for map and geodetic data for the German military. Later in the war, as Allied forces advanced to secure areas in Germany, the Office of Strategic Services set out to find German geographers who could provide information on the location of maps and other documents that the German army had amassed. Leonard Wilson notes that a large trove of maps was procured from Justus Pertus, although it is unclear if these were the captured maps distributed throughout the United States. Wilson describes, OSS map teams arrived at the Justus Pertus plant in Gotha while the city was still partly occupied by German forces. The plant was found in good condition, the working staff was on the premises, and the map stocks intact. Copies of all publications and maps, to the amount of 9 tons, were removed and interviews were conducted with the officials. U.S. Army Major Floyd W. Ho and his unit, the Ho Team, went to Europe in 1944 on a secret mission with special passes issued by Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Forces. Greg Miller notes that Ho Team was there to question European citizens about the location of enemy forces, gather and translate captured documents, and question prisoners of war. They carried with them microfilming equipment, a list of technical universities, government institutions, libraries, and other places that might contain information of interest. Ho Team worked their way across Germany, ending up in Wiesbaden in March 1945, where they received a tip from a captured officer that there would be materials of interest in a small town in the Thuringia region, about 140 miles to the east. After arriving in the area, they interrogated captured RFL officers, one who under pressure blurted out a name, Saalfeld. In Saalfeld, the Ho Team found the warehouse of the German army that was filled with 250 tons of maps, data, and instruments. Miller states, the team called this to 90 tons of maps, aerial photographs, high-quality geodetic survey instruments, and reams of printed data, which they packed into 1,200 boxes to be shipped to the Army service in Washington. It also included approximately 100,000 maps covering all of Europe, Asiatic Russia, parts of North Africa, and scattered coverage of the other parts of the world. Within 100 miles of Saalfeld, another large trove of materials was discovered deep in a potash mine in Heringen, Germany, where the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, The collections housed here in early 1944 were primarily from the Wehrmacht's Military Geology Library and the Patent Office. Mines were regularly being used by the Germans to hide materials, as most were not in active production, were safe from bombing, and were dry. The materials were removed and sent first to Frankfurt and then to the IG Farben building in Offenbach for sorting. Materials were sent to New York to be sorted by US Army personnel, with items of cultural and literary value transferred to the Library of Congress. Geologic, hydrologic, or earth sciences materials were sent to the US Geological Survey. Captured herring and maps were sent from the Army Map Service to the Library of Congress.
Beginning in the Meiji period, 1868 to 1912, in Japan, the Land Survey Department of the General Staff Headquarters was mandated to map certain territories beyond their borders, an area known as the Outer Lands, foreign areas, or Gaihozu. This surveying and mapping work would continue throughout the first half of the 20th century, ending with the fall of the Japanese Empire in 1945. Numerous wars took place during this period, resulting in the mapping of ceded territory. At times, the effort was secretive in nature, such as with mapping in 1905 in Korea, 1906 in Manchuria, and 1908 in China. The program was widespread in scope to match the imperial ambitions of the Japanese. Additional mapping took place in Alaska, Siberia, Micronesia, Taiwan, Mongolia, Thailand, India, Pakistan, and Madagascar. Dr. Shigeru Kobayashi, a leading scholar on the Gaihozu maps, studied in detail the rise of Japanese mapping between 1873 and 1945. During this period of time, different Japanese Army units went about their work in many ways. They would build on the cartographic output of others by capturing maps, most notably after the fall of Nanjing, China in 1937. They sent in their own surveying units to newly acquired territories after the war. By the late 1920s, they were using aerial photography. Full-scale instrumental photogrammetry was collected in 1929 in Korea and subsequently in other areas. Military mapping carried on apace during World War II, with survey units deployed along the front lines. Japanese survey units took over American mapping units in both Manila, the Philippines, and in Batavia, now Jakarta, in the Dutch East Indies. The Japanese surrendered in August 1945 with directives from above to burn the maps before the arrival of the Allied forces. Dr. Kobayashi notes, at the Land Survey Department, which had been evacuated from Tokyo and Nagano Prefecture, massive incineration of maps and aerial photographs was enforced. In Manchuria, the staff of the surveying units of the Kwangtung Army burned many maps and air photos before leaving their place of work. But not everything ended up being destroyed. Maps and plates were discovered at the Geographical Survey Institute in Nagano Prefecture by Colonel Dunbar of the United States Army on September 25, 1945. Dr. Kobayashi notes, at that time, the Americans confiscated original copies of many maps of overseas areas along with the plates for printing. The maps were sent to Tokyo, where the 64th Engineering Topographic Battalion was stationed. The plates were sent to Inagi, Chiba Prefecture, where 50 copies of each map were printed. The original copies and the newly printed maps were sent to the Army Map Service in the United States, which was established in 1942 to supply geographic intelligence. Other stashes of maps survived and stayed in Japan. Professor Tatsuro Asai at Okonomiyaizu University worked with Major Tadashi Watanabe, secretly arranging for 50,000 map sheets to be transferred from the headquarters of the Japanese Army to the Institute for the Science of Natural Resources. These maps were then distributed to a wide array of institutions, universities, and public libraries in Japan. Through other means not fully understood, maps made their way to Tohoku University and the University of Tokyo. Maps came to the United States along the following path. The maps were taken from the Geographical Survey Institute in Nagano, the Southern Manchuria Railroad Company, Toua Dobun Shoin, a Japanese educational institution in China, the Narashino Army School, and the geographical section of the General Staff Office of the Japan Imperial Army. The material were sent to the Army Map Service, who then distributed them to 35 libraries in the United States. The captured maps from both Germany and Japan ended up with the Army Map Service. As World War II began, the US government, including the Office of Strategic Services and the Army Map Service, were in dire need of accurate maps of enemy territory. The AMS issued a call for maps to help with the war effort. Over time, the maps were procured from the National Archives, the Department of Agriculture, private collections, and university, college, and public libraries. These groups enthusiastically responded to the AMS request by sending a variety of materials in addition to maps, such as books, photographs, and reports. Between 1942 and 44, the United States and Britain, with the aid of other allied countries, continued to procure maps and produce new maps from the ones that were captured. The AMS never forgot the generosity of the American libraries at the outset of the war and decided to thank them by distributing the output of their work, as well as the captured German and Japanese maps, to those libraries willing to take them. The libraries had to agree to the terms of deposit, amongst which there were the requirement to index or catalog the materials, to loan them upon request, and to inform the AMS of new purchases through an accessions list. The program was established as a partnership between the College Depository Program and the AMS Topographic Command, or TOPCOM. In a letter dated November 15, 1945, W.D. Milne, Colonel of the Army Map Service Corps of Engineers, wrote to members of the AMS Depository Library Program that American units captured a rather large quantity of foreign maps. The maps had been and presently were being shipped to the AMS for evaluation. The corpus included a large number of duplicates that would be desirable and beneficial to distribute to civilian institutions. Milne asked only certain libraries to let him know if they were interested in captured maps, and if so, what areas. Those libraries must have already accepted our proposal to serve as a depository for Army Map Service map productions. In a letter dated January 23, 1946, from Charles Steele, chief of the AMS library, he writes, "The Army Map Service has received a number of captured maps during the World War II. Distribution of these maps will be made by this office in the latter part of 1946 or the first part of 1947 to select geographically located libraries." This distribution was not to be confused with the original depository plan, as the captured maps would be given to a subset of libraries due to their limited quantity. In 1946, at the American Library Association midwinter meeting held in Chicago, a committee met to discuss the distribution of the World War II captured maps to select libraries. The committee was appointed to deal with the logistical and technical questions sure to arise from the distribution of maps, with a heavy emphasis on how to store them safely. The list of libraries receiving the maps was included in a letter dated February 27, 1950, to the depositories from C.B. Ruzek, Jr., Lieutenant Colonel, Corps of Engineers. He notes that due to limited stocks, it has not been possible to distribute copies of all captured maps to each library on the attached list. 150 libraries received approximately 20,000 maps as part of the standard AMS depository program. The captured maps were sent to a smaller geographically dispersed group of 35 libraries. Over the next few years, the captured maps arrived in libraries across the United States. On the right, you see a subset of libraries that received the original map dispersal. Note that maps were sent to the University of Tennessee and to the Hoover Library at Stanford University.
The captured maps were donated to the UT libraries in 1989 by the UT Geography Department and never cataloged. The plan was to leave the collection in storage with other uncatalogued map collections until they could be evaluated. A finding aid had been created years prior for the captured maps, which later proved marginally helpful in identifying the scope of the collection. As time went on, other collection-related projects and initiatives took precedence over the captured maps and smaller collections. Before the discovery of the Ruzek letter, no documentation was known as to how the captured maps came to UT. This led me in 2019 to contact a number of groups who might have more information. A conversation with Dr. Leonard Brinkman, who had supervised the UT Geography Department map library from 1980 to 1989, helped piece together some background history surrounding the captured maps at UT. He recalled that the maps in their original boxes had been stored under the football stadium since the late 1940s to early 1950s, when the geology and geography departments were joined as one department. In 1980, the geography department removed the boxes from Neyland Stadium and brought them over to Alumni Memorial Gymnasium, where they began housing and building the map collections. In 1989, the geography department donated the map collections to UT libraries, where they were housed in Hoskins Library. Definitive knowledge of the provenance of the collection would not be confirmed until 2020, with the circulation of the letter by Ruzek from 1950, listing the libraries who would receive the captured maps.
Stanford entered into the repository arrangement with the AMS in the early 1940s, when Stanford president Ray Wilbur agreed that the university would house depository materials at the Hoover Library and the East Asia Library, or EAL, both under the umbrella of the Hoover Institution. Almost immediately, the staff at the Hoover Library entered into negotiations with the university librarian, Nathan Van Patten, to transfer the materials, including the captured German maps, to the general collections of Stanford University libraries housed in the main branch, Green Library. The map transfer took place in 1952, with Sewell being designated as the official repository soon after. East Asian materials, including the captured Japanese maps, stayed at EAL for another 50 years. The German maps were integrated into the central map collection and were cataloged at a basic level on cards that were held in a separate card catalog, only available to patrons during limited public service hours. As late as 1988, no systematic work was being carried out to integrate the map holdings into an online catalog. On October 17, 1989, the Loma Prieta earthquake struck, causing enough damage to Green Library that the old wing of the library had to be closed for renovation. The central map collection moved and was merged with the Earth Sciences map collection at the Branner Earth Sciences Library. In order to support both map collections, staffing was increased with the hiring of a full-time map librarian and a half-time map cataloger. No funding was allocated to do a retrospective conversion of the catalog cards into digital format, leaving the staff and students to do this work manually. The sets were tackled first, with the German captured maps added to the online catalog, with no mention of their provenance. In 1996, Provost Condoleezza Rice directed the Hoover Institution and Stanford libraries to reassign materials to Stanford libraries that were more or less commonplace in order to cut down on redundancies in collections and services. This would allow the Hoover archives to concentrate their efforts on the specialized material in their collections. This realignment included the East Asia Library, with all staff and collections coming under the management of the university librarian. Talks commenced between myself and the head librarian at the East Asia Library to discuss the sizable map collection held in the basement and Hoover Tower. An agreement was struck in 2001, with the maps moved to Branner Library in 2002. Included in this collection were the captured Japanese military maps in pristine condition, apparently never having been touched since they were unboxed and set on shelves over 50 years prior. Once moved, they sat at Branner Library for 6 more years. In 2008, a graduate student in the Center for East Asian Studies, Mayu Hassi, arrived at Branner Library, having heard that the East Asian map collection was housed in the sub-basement. Over many months, under the supervision of Jane Ingalls, the assistant map librarian, she examined the collection with a remit to report on the scope and depth of the materials. She determined the collection mainly consisted of Japanese military maps surveyed and produced by the Japanese Imperial Army, roughly between the 1880s and the 1940s. She noted that from the stamps and the handwriting on the back of some of the maps, that a few were originally housed in the Japanese Military Academy of Hiroshima. In addition to the topographic sheets were maps including information about forestry, water, natural resources, and traffic capacity. Ms. Hassi obtained funding from the Center for East Asian Studies to begin work processing the collection. She contacted others who held copies of the maps, including Academia Sinica in Taiwan and Tohoku University in Japan. Over the next year, she created an inventory of the collection, bringing the contents to the attention of Dr. Karen Wigan and other East Asian scholars at Stanford. A map workshop was held in October 2010 to view and discuss the maps in more detail, specifically discussing their research potential. At the same time, Dr. Ai Chun Fan at Academia Sinica contacted Ms. Hassi, requesting to visit Stanford to view the collection with an offer to help sort the materials. The visit took place on December 9th, 2010, with the outcome being an arrangement that in exchange for copies of the digital scans created by the libraries, Academia Sinica would send 2 graduate students to Branner Library for a month to identify, sort, and provide index maps for all sets in the Japanese collection. Word spread about Stanford's collection with Azusa Tanaka, the Japanese studies librarian at the University of Washington, visiting in July of 2015. Around the same time, the University of Washington entered into negotiations with Oregon State University to absorb their captured Japanese map collection. With this gift came official documentation, including the previously mentioned letters from the Army Map Service outlining the program and asking for participation. This clarified the process whereby the libraries had received their captured maps. Ms. Tanaka shared this information with Stanford, who later shared it with Greg at the University of Tennessee. Over the next decade, Stanford's corpus was completely cataloged and processed, primarily by Jane Ingalls and map assistant Shizuka Nakasaki. This was accomplished with the jumpstart received from the graduate students from Academia Sinica, the ability to copy catalog the records created by the University of California, Berkeley, and consistent funding to hire a part-time staff member fluent in Japanese. After the maps were cataloged, they were sent to an in-house scanning lab on a regular schedule with images uploaded into the library catalog SearchWorks. Interactive index maps were created and added to Stanford's spatial search engine, Earthworks, and an ArcGIS online web portal. In the final tally, the Stanford collection consisted of 296 sets with a total of 9,605 sheets.
The partnership between the University of Tennessee Libraries and Stanford University Libraries grew out of a need by UT to learn more about the provenance of their captured map collection. The goal was to make the collection more accessible to the public, but in reality, there was never an appropriate storage facility, a sufficient amount of time, or enough resources to catalog, scan, and display the maps online. I learned that Stanford had already digitized and made available online a large collection of Japanese captured maps. In January 2019, I contacted Julie to ask if she needed any Japanese maps to fill gaps in Stanford's collection. It quickly became clear that without detailed catalog records with sheet level information, there was no way to ascertain in advance if any of the maps were new to Stanford's collection. The only solution was to send all of the Japanese maps to Stanford for processing. We soon came to an agreement that UT would donate all of its captured map collections to Stanford. We acknowledged that while there would certainly be duplicative content, it was the most efficient way to find out if the UT collection contained unique maps to add to the Stanford corpus. In March 2020, I contacted the MapsL community in regard to the partnership between UT and Stanford, with the goal to ascertain what other libraries held captured map collections, and if they knew the provenance of their holdings. Numerous responses were received, with most stating that they had no documentation as to the history of their collections. The collections varied in size, with some libraries holding dozens of maps, while others held considerably more. Some libraries noted that a portion or all of their maps came to their collections from faculty or staff participation in the Library of Congress summer program. Susan Powell at the University of California, Berkeley, provided a much needed piece of the puzzle with the letter from C.B. Ruzek Jr., dated February 27, 1950, that listed all of the libraries who were to receive the captured maps from the AMS. This list conclusively proved that the libraries at UT and Stanford received their maps through the AMS repository program. Moving the maps weighing 1,650 pounds out of the basement of Hoskins Library was a bit challenging. 2 small elevators were the only means of transporting the maps to the ground floor, which meant they would have to be packed on pallets, small enough to fit inside the elevators. The maps were organized by size and roughly in geographic order. It was necessary to transport the larger maps on a cart in the elevator, then transfer them to the larger pallets on the first floor. Cardboard, Tyvek, bubble wrap, and metal banding was used to pack the maps. The maps were packed on 7 pallets and mailed via FedEx Freight on July 12, 2019, arriving 10 days later in California.
Processing of the collections was overseen by Andrea Olson and began immediately upon receipt, with separate workflows established for the 2 collections. The German collections were sorted by library specialist Tamara Reed with the help of student workers. 159 sets have been completely processed, which included 9,466 maps. Of this corpus, 37 completely new sets were added to the collection, and 47 existing sets had new maps or different additions added to them. The new sets included maps from Scandinavia, Greenland, Morocco, and Eastern Europe with a range of scales. All of the maps have been processed with a duplication rate of 80%. While most of the maps were unstamped, some of the maps contain provenance information as they were stamped by the Army Map Service, the U.S. Defense Mapping Agency, and the UT Department of Geography. Shizuka Nakazaki processed the entire Japanese collection in a little over a year. Stanford received 5,995 sheets from UT with 4,816 duplicates. Of the 1,179 new maps, 23 map sets totaling 239 sheets were completely new. 72 map sets were supplemented with 940 sheets filling in gaps in the collections. New map sets included numerous sets of China, Far East Russia, Taiwan, Indonesia, the Philippines, Europe, and India. The maps ranged in scale from highly detailed at 1 to 1,200 to 1 to 1,000,000. 3 donated map sets added substantially to the holdings already in the collection: Japan and Korea at 1 to 50,000 and Manchuria at 1 to 100,000. Each Japanese map was stamped with a unique AMS number. Again, the duplication rate was about 80%. All of the German and Japanese duplicates were sent to the library at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. It is clear that the 2 libraries received substantially duplicative collections, but there were meaningful differences. Both the German and Japanese collections had different sets, and within sets, there were gaps that could be filled by the other collection. Similar results have been noted when comparing the Stanford and the still in process University of Washington Japanese collections. Full sets are held that do not overlap, and some maps fill in gaps in each other's collections. The next logical step is to compare the Stanford UT holdings and the fully processed University of California, Berkeley's German and Japanese collection. As previously noted, when Stanford's German maps were cataloged, the provenance of the collection was not tracked. This made it impossible to know with certainty which maps had been received through the AMS program. With the integration of the UT maps, catalogers were able to remediate the records to add this information due to the large number of duplicates in both collections. The Stanford records now note which maps have come to the library via UT and include a source note stating maps distributed by the United States Army Map Service following capture from foreign militaries during World War II. A provenance note states that the German maps are part of the German World War II captured map collections, and the Japanese maps are part of the Japan World War II captured map collections.
Captured maps remain unprocessed in many library collections across the United States. One must consider the pros and cons of accessioning these materials given the size and complexity of the corpus. By comparing the collections that have been processed, it allows the community to consider the value of accessioning more collections. Is there enough difference across the known collections to warrant the work necessary to find the unique maps in a specific collection? How many collections would have to be processed in order to safely assert that most of the unique maps received by the United States libraries had been identified. It is important to the community to know what was received in total. Processing more of these collections is sure to yield a very high number of duplicates, probably in the range of 80% or more. Space is always at a premium in map libraries, and knowing that the maps held in any one institution are likely to be held in another makes them candidates for deaccessioning and donating without processing, as was done with the UT collection. Finding suitable homes for maps is an arduous, time-consuming, and expensive task for both the donor and the receiver. Therefore, there should be compelling reasons to process the materials at each library if resources can be found. As more collections are cataloged and scanned, theoretically, the process of identifying individual maps and sets becomes easier for each subsequent library. For example, Stanford's collection leveraged the cataloging work done by UC Berkeley for both their German and Japanese map sets. An argument can be made that scanning of the same maps need not be done if high quality scans are found at another library, leaving only new sets of maps that fill gaps in an existing collection to be digitized. Scanning allows worldwide access to collections now held primarily in paper format and has proven to be quite popular. Stanford's scan set of Japan at 1 to 50,000 are the most downloaded items from their digital repository. A worthwhile enterprise would be to create a digital clearinghouse of all the captured maps, with each library submitting their unique content to a shared image catalog. Creating a shared catalog would allow for new scholarship in a variety of subject areas. This could build on existing interfaces. Here are two examples that could serve as the starting point of a bigger project. On the left-hand side of the slide, you see Stanford's coverage of maps of Japan from the captured map collection. This has not yet been updated with UT's editions. Note that the coverage is sparse in many areas, and for some sets, there are missing maps, such as the bright yellow patch in Western China, with 3 maps missing, 1 in the center and 2 at the edges. On the right, you see an index map for an East Asia set at a scale of 1 to 500,000, with the individual sheets from the set held at Stanford in green and the missing maps outlined in red. Clicking on one of the green squares brings up a pop-up window with more information about the map and a direct link to the scan of the item. Because of the way the data is stored in the backend database, it is quick and easy to update these indexes with content held at another holding library, including the links to their scans. By creating this kind of online union catalog, one would be able to ascertain what was taken out of the collections in Germany and Japan. This would allow researchers to get a more complete picture of what cartographic materials were available to the armed forces at that time. It would give one the opportunity to research when original surveying was done and when the invading forces relied on captured maps themselves to gain knowledge of a region. Such a project would be large enough in scope that grant funding would most likely be needed to accomplish the goal. Tackling these collections is a major endeavor and one that must be considered from many angles. Strong support from the faculty who are driven by interesting research questions would make funding these projects more compelling. In conclusion, we leave you with these thoughts. We presented this talk at the Western Association of Map Libraries last fall, as many of the member libraries have these collections. There was discussion about processing the additional collections, but there is little hope that this will happen soon due to constrained budgets and staffing. But this may change slowly over time. The University of California, Riverside donated their captured German and Japanese maps to the University of California, Berkeley. These will be processed and scanned. Other libraries may decide they have the capacity to do this work as well. Might it be a worthwhile endeavor to create a digital clearinghouse of all the captured maps with different libraries and private collections submitting their unique content to a shared image catalog. At present, there have been ongoing conversations with the librarians at Stanford, the University of Washington, and the Library of Congress about the Japanese map collections held at each institution in order to consider possible collaboration on metadata sharing, scanning, and access. This has the potential to become a more expansive project with additional libraries that hold these map sets. Working collaboratively on this project has allowed us to learn a great deal more about how the collections came to our libraries and the overlap in the materials themselves. Obviously, there's more that can be done, and we look forward to continuing the work in the years to come. This is our first time presenting to general map users about these materials. It leads us to wonder, how would you use these maps for your own purposes for research or general interest? Do any of you have captured maps such as these in your own collections? What value do these maps bring to the global community? How do they inform the discussion about World War II and military mapping in general? We would like to acknowledge the following people who helped on the project. From the University of Tennessee, Jeff French, Jonathan Dennison, Steve Percival, Tyler Shalant, William DeLeonardis, Sonia Opachik, Jason Wood, Brian Davis, and Terrell Whitaker. From Stanford University, Andrea Olson, Shizuka Nagasaki, Tamar Ravid, Jane Ingalls, David Medeiros, Megan Trott, Peter Crandall, Digital Production Group, Digital Library Systems Services, and many student workers. We also would like to thank Susan Powell, Heiko Murr, John Anderson, Ronald Grimm, and Ryan Moore.
Finally, we leave you with a list of resources and contact information. We have 2 World War II map exhibits that are up, one about maps from the Office of Strategic Services and an Army Map Services City Plans links, and links to both of those are in this slide deck. The German captured maps in Stanford's catalog can be linked directly, as well as the Japanese captured maps in Stanford's catalog. I've also made a finding aid that will help you to find more resources about this collection including all of the libraries that have received these maps that we know of, and more reference information that will lead to information about the Japanese maps. We have a map index portal as well, and our spatial data catalog. As Greg mentioned, we published the open access article, The Acquisition of World War II Captured Maps, a case study that's available for all of you to see. And we also have made this slide deck available for everyone. And after we finish sharing the screen, we'll put the slide deck in the chat window so that all of you can get to that right away and get access to all of these links. We have our contact information down at the bottom, and we look forward now to taking any of your questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen since I will go ahead and share the slide deck, and so you can get access to all of the links as well.
Okay, thank you, Julie and Greg. Obviously, this is a little bit different presentation than many of our topics where we look at 19th century, 18th century, 17th century maps. In many ways, this is our history that you've brought to our attention. There are already some questions in the chat, and let me see if I can get to them. Okay, Imre Demhart, have you been able to locate where parts of the Justus Perthus captured maps ended up today?
No, we have not. Right, Julie, do you want to?
Yeah, that's right, Greg. And you know what's one of the things I think that's interesting is that we both found is so little information has been, so little research has been done about these collections at all. coming into the United States or where they came from. It's been really surprising how, in a way, sort of how difficult it was to track what had happened to these maps and how they came to be with us. So we don't really know a lot about it at all. Greg Miller, who we referenced and who we linked to his article that I think it might have been in the Smithsonian. Is that right, Greg? I don't know if you remember. He wrote about the justice purpose maps.
I believe so.
It's in our article.
Yeah.
We'll put that link in again as well.
Yeah.
Hey, Mike Flaherty asked, did any of the maps have security classification markings?
Yes, definitely. The Japanese maps certainly did. I would imagine the German did as well, but that was brought up to me more than once when Shizuka was working on the maps. She would say to me, these say top secret on them. Are we allowed to scan these? What are, that? So yes, they definitely did.
Jenny Runyon asked, do any of the captured maps from Germany or Japan cover the United States?
That's interesting that you mentioned that, because Julie, didn't you receive an email not long ago that Germany had, would you tell the story?
So we know that there was some mapping of Alaska. We know that for sure. And then Imre is actually on the call. Imre, I don't know if you want to unmute and tell us about the contact that you received just this week. I believe you're on the call. I thought I saw you log in.
I can probably give a little bit of information about that because Imre has contacted me. There's a researcher in Germany who's looking for an aeronautical series at, I think, a scale of 1 to 500,000.
Correct.
At least there's one sheet that covers the Providence, Rhode Island area. And so this researcher is trying to find more out about that series. There's the implication that there would be more to the series. But I did a quick search of Library of Congress and I didn't come up with it. I mean, on their online catalog. But as you said, some of these things are probably still uncatalogued and unprocessed.
We contacted Heiko Moore at UC Berkeley. He's the map cataloger at UC Berkeley, and he has a voluminous knowledge about the German maps that are in the collection. He hadn't seen any of these. He and I both looked at them and agreed that it looked like it was a set. The way that the maps were printed made it look as if it were a set of maps and more would have been produced. He did a search through OCLC pretty exhaustively and could not find anybody who had a record of it. And so the thought is, yes, maybe there are maps of the United States that were done, aeronautical charts, but we don't have any actual evidence besides this one map at this point.
I'm sure there's more out there. We just haven't found them yet.
I have unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Possibly as a tip for locating which German maps were in existing, the Wehrmacht produced so-called Planhefte, meaning directories of what was produced and just having the index sheets therein. And I know that Planheft for Asia, Planheft for Africa, and Planheft for Australia. I can't imagine that there are many Australian maps in, but if you look for so-called Planheft, plan and heft, just leaflet, something like this, this is a loose leaf compendium which could be easily updated, and if they are coming occasionally to the market on Amazon and on eBay, quite pricey, so you have to pay $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 for them, but they are the most valuable information on what was out there, at least for the German realm.
Okay, a question from John Doctor. Did any other countries receive large quantities of captured German or Japanese maps? Were they distributed to libraries in those countries?
As far as we know, no. We haven't found any evidence that in any sort of numbers that they were distributed outside the United States.
Okay. Hey, Stephen Nagler asks, thanks very much for the fascinating presentation. Hopefully the digitized maps will be available for future generations. What provisions are in place to ensure the digital data does not decay or become obsolete?
Stephen, I'm glad you asked that. Stanford has, in the libraries, we've developed what's known as the Stanford Digital Repository, and it's a repository for holding all of the digital content that we put in it, from digital data sets to electronic books, to map collections, to student theses. It's a fully compliant digital repository. We keep multiple copies in multiple different locations of the whole database. It's refreshed regularly, and the software and the hardware is kept up to date in order for us to be able to migrate all the content from one system to another. And so it's very important to us that all of the content we have is available to everyone 24/7 in perpetuity. And we have a group that does nothing other than work on that repository and make sure that the maps will be, and all of our content will be available now and into the future. We're using it to store scientific data, surveys, meeting government mandates for long-term preservation of data and content. So we can be certain that this content is receiving the highest care. At Stanford, we consider the digital materials we have to be equally as valuable and as important as the paper materials. And so we steward both of them for long-term care and preservation now and into the future.
Ronald Gibbs asks, or says, thanks for a great lecture. As a related question, what was the status of maps of the Pacific and Asia in the US in 1941?
Ron, I'm not 100% sure what your question is. Do you want to, can you give us a little more context?
Well, I remember reading that the maps were just not available to the military, and so this really hampered planning for the long term. And I wondered, Julie, if you had any insight, or Greg had insight, as to what sources were available and how they quickly rounded up sources.
Yeah, well, I know they relied heavily on libraries and Library of Congress and U.S. Geological Survey, and a lot of the universities across the country and federal agencies at the onset to help with mapping and procuring maps that they could use as base maps. Julie, do you want to add?
Yeah, I think, Ron, one of the articles that we reference in the back section of our article that we wrote, there are a couple of articles there that talk specifically about the lack of materials held by the Army Map Service and how they went out specifically to try and find information, and how they were working with the British, most specifically, to try and get as much information as they could. But they also sent people directly into the, like the OSS was making maps, collecting maps, sending people out in the field to do surveying and to find any maps they could in collections. So it was a really hurried effort to try and get the cartographic information they needed. That was one of the reasons they also wanted to distribute these maps out to libraries. So if they needed to have maps again at the ready, they knew they were held broadly across the United States and could be recalled at any point in time that they needed them. So they did not want to be caught flat-footed again.
Oh, very interesting. Thanks for the information.
You're welcome.
Good to see you.
You too.
Question from Andrew Capuchinas, and I apologize if I've mispronounced your name. The Polish site in the www.mapiwig.org contains thousands of high-def digital images of German, Austro-Hungarian, Polish, Russian, Lithuanian, Latvian maps. Just a minute. From the mid-19th century through the end of World War II. many, if not most, with military security markings. I suggest that the gaps in the U.S. library collections can be filled by these easily downloadable map images available to anyone as long as credit is given to the source. Not a question.
Yeah, Andrew, thank you for that. I'm familiar
Yeah,
with that
that's great.
site. And one of the things I think that's interesting is when we start to create the same sort of finding aids for the German maps that we have for the Japanese maps, we won't even have to download them. We'll be able to link directly to those map images and have people get directly to them. So I think we could do that. We can also talk to them about the long-term storage of their materials and if they have a good repository system for them. So I think there's really some opportunities here for collaboration with these other websites that are producing and housing collections like this. So thank you for the reminder on that. That's really useful.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. Okay, Andrew Rhodes, this is a really fantastic presentation. Thank you. Do the Japanese maps include any maps of military operational plans?
I would have to say I don't know for sure. It's definitely worth checking out. As I said, you can see them to the links in the slide deck that we provided, and you can take a look there and see if there are any there. I don't remember there being any specifically, but there's so much material, it's hard for me to know.
Hey, Ronald Decker, do any of these maps, particularly German, have use by US military during the Cold War or even the current Ukraine war? Or were they superseded by more recent and more detailed satellite-based maps? Were Japanese maps used in the Korean War?
I don't know. Julie, do you?
Yeah, I don't know either. You know, it's interesting to me because so many of these collections were uncatalogued. It's hard for me to believe that they were used very heavily. Maybe at the Library of Congress, they had better control over these, or if the AMS, passed them down to other agencies over time, but we didn't look for that specifically, so can't really speak to that very well.
Okay, I think I've hit most of the questions. Again, thank you on behalf of the Washington Map Society and the other, our other partner map societies. I would like to send each of you some gifts for this presentation. I tried to get these personalized to your geographic area. I'm sorry, Greg, there wasn't a whole lot on Tennessee. But okay, the Cut Line Map Company has an ornament with the outline shape of Tennessee, so you'll get that. And then in terms of cards from this new company that's now called Territory, you'll have a set of cards from Washington, D.C. So it'll be a reminder of this presentation.
Thank you very much.
Okay, and for Julie, well, there's a lot more on San Francisco. So I have a cut line map of San Francisco.
Beautiful.
Wow.
And a set of cards from the territory of San Francisco.
Fantastic. Thank you. That's so thoughtful.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
So, I mean, okay, we're about 10 minutes after the hour. I would say if still quite a few people on, and let's, feel free to socialize for a few minutes. If you have a few more questions for Greg and Julie, it's fine, or if you just want to chat with each other. Unmute yourself if you want to.